Field, founder of Sequential Circuits in 1974. Dave has received a degree in both electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley. In 1977, Dave designed a Prophet 5, the world's first fully programmable polyphonic synthesizer. Hey, all these plosives, sorry. Polyphonic synth, and the first musical instrument with an embedded microprocessor. Sequential released many innovative instruments and drum machines over the next 10 years. Dave is known as the driving force behind the MIDI specification in 1981, and in fact, it was Dave who coined the acronym. In 1987, he was named a Fellow of the Audio Engineering Society for his continuing work in the area of musical synthesis. After Sequential, Dave was president of DSD, Inc., and R&D division of Yamaha, where he worked on physical modeling, synthesis, and software synthesizer concepts. When he then started the core R&D group in California and produced the Wave Station and other technology, which I didn't know. I don't know, Wave Station. He took over president at Sears Systems and developed the first software synth. I didn't know this either, Dave, for Intel in 1994, and followed by the first professional software synth, Reality, released in 1997. Realizing the limitations of software, maybe we'll get to what you think those limitations are, especially in light of something like the new Spectrasonics 2.5. Are you familiar with that, Dave?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So that kind of bridges the hardware and software together. Dave returned to hardware, started Dave Smith Instruments, starting with the Evolver hybrid analog digital synthesizer in 2002. The product lineup has grown to include the Prophet X that he just released recently here, Prophet Rev 2, Prophet 6, OV6 with Tom Oberheim, Pro 2, Prophet 12 synthesizer, and the Tempest drum machine with Roger Lynn. So these are like all iconic names if you're into anything about synthesizer or synthesizer design. Pretty impressive. And in 2018, I believe it was in September, right, Dave? DSI changed its name back to Sequential.
Yeah, that just happened.
Yeah, so, well, congratulations. So I'd like to ask, why did you decide to go back to the Sequential name?
Well, there are a few different reasons. One is we just came out with Prophet X, and that was the second product that we decided to use the Sequential name on. I don't know if everybody knows the story about how we got the Sequential name back, but technically, Yamaha had purchased Sequential Circuits. Well, not technically, they did, as it was about to go bankrupt. And so they owned all the names, the Prophet names, Sequential names, etc. And then after a year, they just shut the company down because, well, a lot of reasons, we won't go into that. But just, I guess maybe about 4 years ago, I didn't know this was happening, but Kakahashi, the founder of Roland, had sent a letter to the president of Yamaha, just kind of suggesting that they give the name back to me. And so out of the blue, I got a call from somebody at Yamaha, and he said, hey, do you want the Sequential name back? And I hadn't thought about that, and I said, well, sure. And it just sort of happened that way. So it was kind of one of those really cool industry stories that you don't get to hear very often. To have somebody as big as Yamaha to do something like that when they didn't have to. You probably all know there's plenty of stories in the music industry where people lost their names through acquisitions or whatever and were never able to get them back, even if they're not being used. So that was a pretty gracious thing for Yamaha to do, and for Kakahashi to do for me without me knowing. So so we got the name back, and as it turns out, we were working on what became the Prophet 6. And we sort of realized, well, the Prophet 6 is kind of a reincarnation of the Prophet 5, so what a perfect product to use the Sequential name on again, and that's what we did. And that was 3 years ago, I think, is when the Prophet 6 came out. So we decided to use the name again on the Prophet X, just because it seemed right. The Prophet X is sort of a rough follow-up of the Prophet 2000. and a Prophet 3000 from the 80s, because it's, I think, the first sampler since then that has digital samples playing back through analog filters. So then about a month and a half ago, I just started thinking that maybe it was time to change the company name. There's a few reasons. First, Dave Smith Instruments is just way too long of a name, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's annoying. When I first started this company 16 years ago, I didn't know what I was doing, or I had no plan. I didn't have any clue that I'd end up with a company doing all the products we're doing now, so it seemed like a good enough name at the time, and I think we just sort of outgrew it. But another part of it is, when I first started Dave Smith Instruments, it literally just was me for the first 5 years, so I did everything, and so it sort of made sense. But since then, we've grown to, well, we're a huge company now, we have 14 people. But the point is that all of our products are pretty much a team effort, because everybody in the company is a synth freak, and everybody gets involved, doesn't matter what their job titles are. So it sort of reflects that the company is not all about me anymore, it's a team thing, and so it was funny. I just went in, we have a weekly meeting, and I just went in and threw it on everybody. I said, well, what do you think? Should we change the name? And I was surprised that everybody was very positive that we should do it. So we just decided that quickly just to do it.
That's always good when you're the boss, right?
Excuse me?
It's always to agree with the boss, good to agree with the boss.
No, you'd be surprised how often people don't agree with the boss. Especially if we're talking designs of new products, when we're trying to decide what features to put in, and we have all kinds of lively arguments. So no, it's not quite a pushover here.
You want to bring up some questions for the audience?
Well, I definitely, right, since he was talking about Yamaha.
Yeah, go to the mic.
Yeah, speak up, step up.
You're,
No.
I can like stand at the table.
No, right there. There's a microphone.
Okay, so I have like a conspiracy theory question for you, Dave.
Okay.
The Prophet 6 comes out like 2015, right?
Yes.
Okay, so do you think that it's a coincidence that in the very next year, Yamaha releases the reincarnation of the DX7 through the montage, right? Because the DX7 is supposed to have ended the reign of the analog synthesizers the first time around, right?
Yeah.
So now you release in 2015, you release the Prophet 6, and then here comes the year later, Yamaha releasing a new DX7. What do you think about that? Is that just a coincidence?
I think it's a coincidence. I think all companies have discovered the fact that vintage sells. That's how if I go back, I can answer this question a lot of different ways, but if you look back in the last 15 years ago, I think the analog revival started in 2002. That was the year I introduced the Evolver Synth, and it was also the year that Bob Moog, who had just gotten his name back, introduced the Minimo Voyager. So all of a sudden, for the first time in a long time, there were two new analog synths. And over the next few years, it just slowly ramped up from there. And that was about the same time that everybody was rediscovering all the old analog synths from the 80s. So everybody was buying Jupiter 6s and Prophet 600s and OBXs, whatever. So the combination of people using the old stuff, talking about it, getting excited about it, and new stuff becoming available, we've just seen this continuous growth for the last 5 or 10 years for analog synths. So everybody's trying to get a vintage angle. We sold a lot of Prophet 6s just because it looked like a Prophet 5, even though you probably know that I've been quoted many times that I don't want to redesign something that I've already designed. Like I would never build an exact Prophet 5 because I already did that, and there's no reason to do it again. So vintage sells. I'm sure Yamaha thought that maybe it makes sense to reintroduce the DX7, but it's interesting that You know, DX7 when it came out was the first half of what killed the analog industry. The second half was when the Korg M1 came out and sampling became mainstream. But you know, they sold over 200,000 DX7s and over like 250,000 M1s, but you know, right now there's really no value to those compared to the value of an analog synth from the 80s. You know, Prophet 5s cost $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 now, and they were $4,000 back then. Whereas you could buy a DX7, you know, pretty cheap anytime because there's just really not demand for vintage digital like there is for vintage analog. So I'm sure Yamaha's probably thinking that, okay, if we do a DX7, that's, you know, some people will be interested in that as a vintage sound. And for that matter, in Prophet 12, we have linear FM is a feature we added to that because it has digital oscillators going through analog filters. So, you know, we could do FM on the Prophet 12 with analog filters, but it's not going to be a conspiracy thing like it was in 1983, where the DX7 or FM reemerging is going to kill analog. I'm pretty convinced that analog is here to stay, certainly subtractive synthesis. It's passed the test of time. It's been around for 50 years now. It's still used every day. Everybody knows how it works. You can go up to any subtractive synthesis instrument and you know what's going to happen when you turn the cutoff knob and when you turn the resonance knob. It's just something that's easy to deal with as a musician. It's got a very wide palette of sounds with a very simple architecture. So I think it's going to be around. I don't think any reissue of a DX7 is going to affect that.
So you're not worried, not worried that it's going to repeat history here?
Oh, not in the slightst.
Okay, I have another kind of a low-level technical question for you. The Prophet 10 consisted of, from what I understand, 2 Prophet 5s. And,
Yes.
And what I've always been curious of in this technology is where does the 10,000 note limit on the sequencer come from?
Cost of memory in 1981. The original Prophet 5 had a whopping 1 kilobyte of backup memory, and that took 8 ICs to get that 1 kilobyte. I think the OS was 2 or maybe 3 kilobytes total. So memory just costs money. So I forget how much memory was in the poly sequencer that we had in the Prophet 10, but it was probably, I didn't even know if it was 16K, maybe it was. 16K might translate to 10,000 notes, but it would have been just strictly the cost of memory.
Thank you.
Hi Dave, this is Roger Dannenberg. First I want to thank you for beaming in today and taking your time. And the question I have is kind of moving away from vintage and analog towards another trend, I think, in synthesis from the beginnings has been recreating the sounds of acoustic instruments. And it seems like kind of the only approach that industry has pursued has been sampling. You know, now we're to the point where you get sample libraries that are gigabytes, many gigabytes. And I think there's been a lot of research that indicates that maybe that's just the wrong way to go about it. And there's been some really great promising technologies using, I mean, both, the obvious thing is physical modeling, but there's a lot of spectral modeling that I think works even better. And I would probably point to Eric Lindemann's Synth system as maybe the best kind of commercial effort to pursue this. And I just wondered if you have thoughts about, you know, is sampling just going to rule the world forever because people are stuck, or do you think there's hope for, you know, new synthesis methods to flourish out in the commercial space?
Well, there's always hope. I could answer this a number of different ways. One of the reasons the M1 took over the industry in the late 80s is everybody always wanted emulative sounds. They bought Prophet 5s, not because they wanted to play a synthesizer, but it was the only thing at the time where you could hit a switch and go from strings to brass to organ. And that's what most musicians wanted. So when the M1 finally came out, that was, yeah, they finally had their piano, they finally had all their recorded sounds. And in the 20 or 30 years since, pretty much most of the companies have just been building M1s. They just add bits, they add bytes, they get better, but it's been pretty much the same thing. And so I call that the 90s, and I call that whole period the digital dark ages, because there was no life in musical instruments. It was all sampling. And again, that's what a touring musician wants. They have to go up on stage and back up a singer, and they've got to play Hammond organ sounds, and they've got to play piano, and they've got to cover the normal stuff. So as a practical matter, that makes a lot of sense. So backing up as to why you would need an alternate way of playing emulative instruments. Sample sizes are so huge these days that they cover a lot of ground. The Prophet X has 150 gigabytes of samples in it. We just throw an SSD in there and there's no shortage of space. So you don't have to do all the tricks we did a long time ago of looping things. We just don't loop things unless it's a sustained sound. And you could have multiple velocity layers. You could have, obviously every note sample across the keyboard. So I did actually look into physical modeling a lot in the late 80s, early 90s. I thought it was going to be the next big thing, because the idea of, as you know, is to get an emulative sound that you can interact with more, and so take it in different directions. So your plucked string sound can do a lot more than just be a guitar sound. It can morph into other things. At the time, even our first software synth Reality in the mid-90s, we had some physical models in there. They're all pretty basic, just the old clarinet, flute, guitar, horn models. But at one point, I just had this thought that, okay, if I'm trying to model a violin, and so I've got this great string model, and it sounds just like a violin, then you start realizing, well, how do you play this physical model violin so it actually sounds like a violin? And then you start thinking, well, the ideal way is to have some sort of a string and then have some sort of a bow, and that way you can actually articulate the string model more accurately. And then you start thinking, well, if you have a string and a bow, why don't you just play a violin instead of trying to do this from a keyboard with a bunch of controllers? So at the same time, I just sort of lost interest in physical modeling, mostly because I've never been that interested in emulative sounds anyhow. I'm more interested in synthesis. All that being said, there's certainly a lot of room, as you mentioned, with different modeling technologies to take it further. But the other tricky part is, once you have the technology, is how do you shrink that down into a musical instrument that you can perform on and interact with, and so forth. That's one of the great things about software synthesis, is you can kind of do anything. You mentioned the one case where that's a perfect case for doing software, because a couple guys can write software and release it and have it work. They don't have to have factories, they don't have to build hardware, they don't have to deal with service, they don't have to deal with any of that stuff, and yet they could provide a synthesis method that may not make sense in hardware. There's been a lot of other cases like that. Granular synthesis is, I think it's a really cool sound, but it doesn't have a super wide palette, so nobody's going to come out with a hardware instrument that's only does granular synthesis. And even if you did, you'd have to come up with the right amount of controls that make sense and sound good and interact. And that gets me back to the concept of synthesizers as musical instruments. And one of the reasons we did the Prophet X was to try to bring sampling into trying to make it more interactive and more fun to use as an instrument. You know, most of the romplers, they're easy to use, and you can pick your different sounds and you can play them. The workstations, to me, tend to be a little too complicated and overblown, and they're not as much fun to play with. I mean, sure, you go and play your piano, and if you want to take the time, you can do all the multi-track recordings, but, you know, when I look at them, I can hardly figure out how to change programs on them, because they've got these big screens and then all this, you know, it's a workstation. Work. I don't want to work. I want to play. So Prophet X is laid out like a synthesizer, so it's got a bunch of samples and it has all the pianos and all that stuff, but it's meant to interact with. So you start with a sound and the knobs are right where you think they should be to adjust the sound, tweak the filters, change the loop points, do whatever you want, but quickly and easily. And I think it's a completely different experience. And so I'm rambling a whole bunch on your basic question, but does that make any sense as far as the physical modeling part of it and emulative part?
Yeah, and I think what you said about trying to build instruments is a really important part of that. So in fact, that raised, so there's people waiting, I think, to ask questions, but I'm going to squeeze one more in, which is, so building synthesizers as instruments is obviously, you know, one thing, one way to get technology to musicians, and something I've been thinking about, and I wonder if you've thought about, or if you know of anyone else pursuing this, is I think we're at the point where instead of introducing synthesizers as instruments to musicians, we could start introducing artificial musicians to musical groups to play along with them. And I mean, there's, it's not obvious how to turn that into a practical, usable product, but I think it's a really interesting concept to think about. And I just wonder if, you know, what thoughts you have.
So you're talking basically about AI playing along with people, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but not necessarily too much AI. I think you can build, I mean, there's a range of just building something that would serve the role of a, you know, tape player providing a backing track, but imagine that it's interactive, it's cueable, it follows the tempo of the musician and things like that. You know, all the way up to maybe something AI, like you have an AI drummer that comes in and listens to you and really responds to you. But you know, I think there's a spectrum.
Well, there have been a number of audio accompaniment type keyboards over the years. I don't know what the state of them is right now, but I know Korg had some pretty interesting things, even maybe 10 years ago or longer, that would do those sort of things to some degree, where, you know, you could get different styles to play in the background that you could play along with. I don't know if that's caught on. At one point it was much bigger in Europe for some reason than over here, and there was a lot of activity. But I don't know, I'm always a big fan of doing things live and, you know, with real people. In fact, one of my, it always upsets me a little bit when you see a lot of bands touring these days and half the music is coming off main stage, and, you know, you have two people there but you're hearing five. And so I tend to want to push things the other direction to have more stuff played. Especially when people don't bring a drummer, that always pisses me off. You know, spend the money, bring a drummer. But I understand the economics are such these days that if you're a new group and it's just two of you in your bedroom anyhow, you can't necessarily put together a big group and economically tour with it. So there's that side of it. But I don't know, there's room for everything, and, you know, maybe that side could be used for, you know, ideas to help people come up with, you know, new song ideas. But I think even in, you know, GarageBand, whatever, you know, they've got drum loops, they've got all this stuff set up, so you can pretty quickly just plug all that stuff in and have a band behind you. You know, it doesn't interact it much, but so a lot of that stuff is available at different levels. And I suppose anything that gets people to play music is a good thing. You know, sidetracks, that's one of the other good things about software synthesizers. So many kids these days just, if you have a computer, you have a soft synth in there somewhere, and that's how they get their start. And learning how to play a synthesizer because you have free software, it's a good thing. And a lot of those people, they continue with it. Someday they'll buy hardware once they figure out that there's a whole lot of benefit to interacting with a real musical instrument. So I don't know if I answered your question much, but...
Yeah, that's great, thanks. I think there's people, there's more questions.
Okay, thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julie Swango. Thanks for coming here today. I may steal someone's thunder, but I was curious, about MIDI, and I was very curious, I was interested to hear a little bit about what was your involvement about getting that going, and sort of what are your thoughts about its reach today and how it's affected everything musical, whether it's digital, analog, whatever, and then branches of that you see people spinning up saying, oh, that's a cool idea, maybe I can work this into DMX and make a whole new lighting protocol, but it just sort of all goes, I'm just sort of interested to hear what your thoughts are, because I know that you were there on the ground floor of some of that, so I just want to hear what you have to say.
Okay, do we want the 3-minute version or the 20-minute version?
We're stick to maybe 2.5 or 3.
Well, I'll give you the very quick story of how MIDI came to be. So, the Prophet 5 was the first product with a microprocessor, and within a year or two, other companies were also building polysynths with microprocessors because it was the best way to do things back then, switching from dedicated hardware, logic, all that, to a processor. Once you have a processor in a musical instrument, you realize it's really easy for communication between instruments, because you use all kinds of different ways of doing that. So all the different companies back then did that. We had a high-speed serial interface, sequential. Roland had one, Yamaha had one, Oberheim had one. But then after a year, we all started realizing, well, this is sort of lame that you can't connect one to the other. And we weren't going to have people try to build special boxes to connect instruments. So we talk at trade shows. I remember talking to Kakahashi and Tom Oberheim, and we said, well, we should do something. So I went back and decided, well, we really have to do something. So at Sequential, we wrote up a spec called Universal Synthesizer Interface, USI, and I delivered a paper in 1981, October, New York, AES show. And basically I said, here's a interface. It doesn't have to be this, but we all really need to get together and make a common interface. I then organized a meeting at the NAMM show in January of '82, and I invited anybody who made keyboards of any kind to come to this meeting, and I think everybody came. It was a really good turnout. And it was the same thing. I said, here's this USI thing. I don't care if we do this or do something else, but we need to do something. And most people tended to agree, but some people, it was hard to get people to agree to actually do anything about it. And after the meeting, I was kind of bummed out because it looked like it was going to go nowhere. But then I got approached by Roland, who said, well, actually, we want to proceed on this, and so does Yamaha, Korg, and Kawai. So we had a separate meeting with them, and that was pretty much the start of the generation of the MIDI specification. It was those 5 companies that worked together, but as a practical matter, it was mostly Sequential and Roland who did all the work. The other 3 companies didn't really understand what was happening, but they were at least smart enough to come along for the ride. So that's how it got started. Through 1982, we developed the specification, and then December of 1982, we started shipping the Prophet 600, which was the first MIDI instrument. And in January of '83, we, at the trade show, Roland brought over a Jupiter 6, and we plugged it into the Prophet 600. That was actually the first time 2 instruments in different companies were connected. We didn't try it before that. We just kind of showed up with our instruments that were already in production and plugged them in, and it worked. So that was the start, and there was plenty of turmoil at the beginning because the companies that were involved were, they were ragging about it, not invented here, the usual stuff. But they all eventually got dragged screaming into implementing it because they had no choice due to the market. You know, once everybody saw a common interface, they demanded it from everybody else. So at that point, did we imagine what's happening now with MIDI? No. We knew MIDI would be in computers. You know, that was in the original spec, but did we know there would be such a thing as a cell phone and billions of them that would all have MIDI in them? No. Did we know that there were going to be billions of computers around the world all with MIDI? No. But we did design it to be very wide open and flexible, and that part has proven to be good. I mean, it's still version 1.0, 35 years later. It's still used every day, and you know, so I guess we got that part right. And we're all still waiting for MIDI 2.0, but don't ask me about that because I don't care.
Well, thank you. That answered that for me. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Hi, Dave. This is Tracy. And like everyone else is saying, we're so happy that you agreed to be a part of the symposium.
Thank you.
To proceed with what you just said about the impact of MIDI over the years, and now here we are with artificial intelligence and music generation. So do you see possibly how the MIDI structure can be infused with some kind of artificial intelligence structure that's actually part of the MIDI interface?
I don't know if there's any need for it to be part of the interface. You know, we put something in there called SysX, which allows you to do pretty much anything you want to do as far as the protocol. So for artificial intelligence, it's, you know, MIDI is just a protocol. It's the AI can generate notes, it can generate control signals and all of that, and control an instrument with it. So the AI would be not part of MIDI, and MIDI could easily implement or do whatever the AI wants it to. But I don't know, I'm not sure how, I haven't thought about it before, but I'm not sure how that would fit in, or it doesn't seem like it would be necessary to fit in to the protocol, because that would almost be more limiting for the AI, because now all AIs would have to use the spec and they may not want to do things the same way. Whereas if you just use MIDI for what it already does, then you could do anything you want. I mean, presumably you're playing notes and bending the notes and changing the sounds, which, you know, MIDI does just fine.
Okay, so I guess you feel that artificial intelligence wouldn't have that much of an impact on analog and digital synthesis?
Well, again, the instrument is the engine. That's just what makes the sound. And again, I haven't looked into the whole AI stuff. I know there's a lot of work being done there, but there's two sides of it. Either it's the playing the note part of it, in which case the AI MIDI doesn't need to know anything. It's just the AI is telling the instrument to play the note. The other side of it is if the AI is actually trying to create sounds, and even that it can do it without MIDI having to know what is going on. It can, you know, change the filter to this, change the envelope to that, to make a new sound that's going with the AI generated notes. So I just don't see a need for that to be spec'd out within MIDI, because you can do anything you want as far as the instrument's concerned and as far as the AI is concerned without changing MIDI. If I'm understanding the question correctly.
That's fine, thank you.
Hi, Dave. I'm so glad that you're here with us. My question is a follow-on to Julie's about the origins of MIDI, and I was kind of wondering, when you got together at that early stage, were you thinking about sequencing, or were you just thinking about stacking voices? And if so, at what point did the sequencing angle kind of come into that? And how did that evolve the protocol?
Oh, no, sequencing was in there from the beginning. I think even USI spec had the concept of one controller controlling multiple instruments. And, you know, we already had a poly sequencer that worked with the Prophet 5 and then the Prophet 10 that could do all of that. One of the tricky things we had while developing the spec is at Sequential, we had thought of the idea of a multi-timbral instrument. And we were actually working on them. So we wanted a MIDI mode for multi-timbral operation, but we didn't want to totally explain to our competitors why we wanted this mode. So it was a little confusing because we said, well, we got this mode, we get one note per channel, each channel is a different sound. Yeah, that's it. And it was funny because Yamaha, actually, because we didn't fully explain it, they misunderstood what we wanted this mode for, so they implemented it a different way than what we intended, because I think we had called it mono mode or something. And since they ended up putting that in the DX7, and that was when we found out that they misinterpreted it, we had to add a mode to MIDI to cover the Yamaha version of the multi-timbral mode versus the one that we wanted but couldn't tell anybody about. So we had envisioned using computers to drive multiple instruments, and yeah, I mean, historically, you know that home recording actually started because of MIDI, because for the first time with a computer, which were, you know, dreadfully slow back then, so they couldn't do any audio processing, you could do MIDI sequencing on a Commodore 64. And so if you're at home, you could control a drum machine and 2 or 3 synths. And for the first time, a musician by themselves could make a whole track at home. So, and then of course, as computers got faster, they finally started adding audio to that. And now, of course, the audio is a piece of cake to do however many tracks you want to do. So, yeah, it was definitely part of the plan. Yeah, obviously, the simplest implementation that people understood for MIDI was take one keyboard, plug it into another, and play 2 of them at one time. And that was huge back then. You know, everybody had a DX7 and a Prophet 5, and you put them together, and it was actually a really good complement to play together. But no, computers were in it from the beginning, as was sequencing.
Thank you.
Sure.
Dave, thanks so much for your contributions to everything that we do these days. I really appreciate it. I got just a little bit of a 2-part question. When Atari and their 1040 ST and the Yamaha laptop came out with the built-in MIDI interfaces, was that like a really major coup? And was there like behind the scenes work with these 2 companies to try to push for that interface, or did they take it upon themselves, noticing the opportunity?
That they did that on their own. I mean, obviously, I had no idea that either one was happening until it happened. The Yamaha thing never caught on that much, but the Atari ST did, because, you know, it had MIDI, it had, you know, that was the one that had a Synth chip too, right? I think internally.
Yes.
So yeah, the fact that they put a little Synth chip in a computer way back when was pretty awesome.
We were doing peek and poke commands in BASIC, trying to get to make sounds, but it just, you know, to be able to utilize a computer with KCS sequencing software and be able to utilize your hardware was just, it was a huge jump forward for composers at that point.
It was an evolving scene too, because, you know, the computers were evolving at the same time MIDI was, because, you know, the whole synth industry was tiny in the early 80s. You know, we would sell 5,000 or something, or 10,000 or something. And once MIDI came out, all of a sudden, people were selling, you know, 50,000 or 100,000 instruments. So and this whole cottage industry grew up, people making software, sequencers, and interface boxes and all this stuff. So it really was the right thing to do for the industry, and it caused an explosion in the marketplace. And so that's, yeah, it was when the Atari came out and these other things, it was like, whoa, that's kind of interesting, but it was also at the beginning, so it was almost premature as to, becoming a major driving force in music making going forward. But yeah, it'd be interesting to go back someday and actually try to chronicle that year by year, the changes and steps of what came out and what, how many were sold and how many people did this and did that, just to follow that whole progression.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Hey Dave, this is Cameron. I asked you the first conspiracy question. I've got another conspiracy here for you. I guess it's another take on the AI and MIDI situation. There's, with the automated music creation, you brought up the Karma. That was one of the kind of interactive, backing track types of technologies. Now there's a lot more, and all of this technology, this AI stuff that is starting to replace filmmakers and replace musicians and replace musicians in the elevators and in the grocery stores and all this stuff, it's all actually facilitated by the MIDI protocol. If you had just left things with the USI folks, it would have been a disconnected thing that would have never taken place because everyone would have had their own silos. But the MIDI specification kind of created a common protocol, and now, like you said, it's in cell phones, it's in computers, and it is the technology that is facilitating the automation in the music creation. So here's the deal. Do you feel in any way responsible for the fact that AI is going to be taking over the film production group, the elevator music, all of the automated music that you have now, this being driven because of and enabled because of the MIDI specification?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen. AI can have the elevators in the dentist's office. I don't care about that because you can't go bad. I can't get any worse. I don't believe it's going to take over movie compositions. I just, never say never, but I just don't see that happening anytime soon. You can't have the producer come in and say, change this cue to this, and have an AI all of a sudden do it like a real musician would, and especially with synchronizing the film. I mean, there's too much involved for that. It's also interesting because technology is always blamed for putting musicians out of business. Synthesizers before MIDI were, there was a big uproar about that because, technically it was true. You can come in with a Prophet 5 and all of a sudden you can cover, 5 different tracks, so you don't have to bring in a string section, you don't have to bring in all these other musicians, you can do it all with one person. And that's true, it did happen. And it still is. I mean, synthesizers without MIDI have enabled so much change in who plays what when, and it can be a whole lot more efficient. You add MIDI, and of course now you can do that much more because a film composer could stay at home and they could synchronize their MIDI to the film track, and with their bank of synths and soft synths, they can do all their composition and have it all work and not have to always hire a complete orchestra. Though, the bigger films still do bring in real orchestras and play the whole thing. So it's nice that I think it's a good thing. It's liberating for musicians at all levels to be able to participate at any level between one guy at home with one synth all the way up to a full symphony orchestra and a real big studio to do all of this. So I don't think there's a conspiracy here. I think technology and music has always been that way. There's always been a musical Darwinism of which instruments survive and which ones go away. The piano pretty much killed the harpsichord. They're still kind of around, but let's face it, everybody plays a piano, nobody plays a harpsichord, and there's a real good reason for that. I think the piano did a better job at giving the musician the control they want. So I I don't worry about technology putting people out of business. I don't think AI anytime soon is going to have a major impact on music making. And I know a lot of this conference is talking about that, so hopefully this isn't heresy, but I still believe with music, because people said, and this is true too, some of that MIDI music was horrible. Some of those 80s synth bands, come on, it wasn't all that good. But a lot of it was really good. The cell phone, the MIDI cell phone ringtones are horrible. They still are. But at the time, MIDI is basically a compression technique. It allows people to play music like on the original computers. And cell phones is the same thing. They didn't have the power to do much with audio, but they could throw in MIDI ringtones, general MIDI, and they sounded horrible, but they did a job. So, I don't worry about how the technology is used, because, there's always going to be good music and there's always going to be bad music. And maybe AI will make some good music at some point. It probably already has, I shouldn't be saying that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Okay, so the notion that Dave Smith and MIDI is the reason why AI took over our jobs, that's going to be fake news then.
Oh, that's fake news.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's looking at it the wrong way, I make instruments, and I make instruments easy to use, and actually, if anything, the last 20 years, last 10 years, I think we're getting people to appreciate synthesizers as musical instruments again. It took us a while, but people actually now will pay $3,000 for a high-quality analog synth. There's a long time when that wouldn't happen, because the problem with digital synths is, as technology gets cheaper, they get cheaper. So people expect that every product to be better next year and half the cost. But what I usually tell people is, look at the guitar player. Guitar players own, 5, 10 guitars? Well, why do they own 5 or 10 guitars? They all have 6 strings and 3 knobs. What could possibly be different between them? And that's what we're trying to do, is convince people that electronic keyboards have that same personality. So if you play a Prophet 6 and then you play an OB6, they're different instruments. Sure, they overlap, just like, you can play something on a Telecaster, same way you can play something on a Les Paul, but they're different instruments with different sounds. Some musicians will immediately gravitate towards the OB6, others will immediately go to the Prophet 6, and fortunately for us, a lot of people buy both because they're different instruments. They have different personalities, different sounds. And that's what I try to do. That's what we try to do, is get that character, the personality of a musical instrument and part of that was realizing that people still value Prophet 5s 40 years later. This is our 40th anniversary this year of the Prophet 5. And if you had asked me when I was a kid, I was in my 20s when I designed that, if people would still be using that in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I probably would have laughed, not knowing how that would have unfolded. But people say, well, this Jupiter 6 has a sound, this, OBX, whatever, Polymoog. You've got to take them not as pieces of technology, but as musical instruments. And sometimes they have flaws that, back then maybe nobody liked it. Famous stories you all know, the 808, 909. When those came out, we all laughed at them, because we all had sampling-based drum machines that were real punchy and, great samples, and they sounded great. And then Roland came out with these things that sounded like, they sound, how they sound. And so nobody bought them. And they were just kind of there, and then a few years later, a couple guys in Detroit or Chicago or whatever started picking them up, and hey, all of a sudden they invented a whole new style of music based on those instruments. Musical instruments can be very fashionable at times. So it's all about the instrument, and it's just great now that people, I think, finally get it with musical instruments, that it's not just a workstation, you buy it, use it for a couple of years, buy a new one. This is a musical instrument, it does this today, it'll do the same thing in 20 years, and that's why I use it, that's why I like it. And that's why I'm afraid that with things like AI, that maybe you lose some of that and the interaction of the musical instrument. You know, people always ask me, well, you know, are you going to do something like, you know, okay, I want a string sound. And you say this verbally, and the synthesizer plays a string sound. Make it less bright. And, okay, it makes it less bright. And, you know, I'm sure that sort of technology is probably in a lab somewhere or will be soon. But I don't know. It's a musical instrument, you know. You have to hold it, you have to play with it. That's one of the reasons why, you know, the intro mentioned why I was disillusioned with software synthesis after inventing the first ones. I just realized one day that I was never playing our product Reality, which had subtractive synthesis, it had FM, it had sampling, it had physical models. And, you know, it sounded pretty good, but I never used it. And I realized it was because I had to sit in front of a computer, I had to type on a keyboard, I had to drag a mouse, I had to drag sliders up and down and open menus, and then finally go over and have to be able to play the keyboard and make some sounds. And it just didn't feel right musically. Again, there's a lot of good things about software synthesizers. They could do a lot more, but it's just the musical experience, to me, isn't there the same way it is with a piece of hardware in front of you. So, end of speech. End of rant.
Dave, this is Steve. And I had mentioned when I was doing the introduction about the Spectrasonic 2.5. You think that's what Eric Pershing was going for, to go back to that tactile feel of actually the interaction with the software and another attempt to make it more playable, more human?
Yeah, certainly. They have that disadvantage. I mean, Spectrasonics is obviously a hugely capable thing. There's so much stuff in there, and sometimes I think for a musical instrument you can have too many features. In fact, that's what we always have arguments about on our products when we're designing them. The hardest part about designing a musical instrument is leaving stuff out, because there's a sweet spot. If you put too much in there, then it becomes unusable and I think, or harder to use. And I'm a big fan of constrained design. You know, keep it more focused and make it do some things really well and not have to worry about it doing everything. And I kind of got that realization playing around with the Prophet 5 over the years. Because Prophet 5, you know, compared to Synth these days, is fairly simple. You know, it's not that many controls. But then I sit there and say, well, how are we getting all these awesome sounds? And we have this great wide range of sounds, and yet there's only one LFO, there's only two oscillators, and there's only one filter. And it's so simple, and yet the palette is really wide. And so it's a good way to remind yourself that, you know, like Spectrasonics has what, you know, 200 filters or something. You know, it does all kinds of things, which is cool, but as far as immediacy, that's lost. So with this new feature, they of course are now doing that, and you know, it looks pretty cool. I mean, seeing them use a, you know, Prophet 6 or Prophet X and having it control Spectrasonics to be able to interact with it, you know, it does give them that immediacy that they don't normally have. But the more I thought about it, it seems kind of strange to do that if you have this musical instrument that already does all this without Spectrasonics. Well, why don't you just use it? You don't, you know, use Spectrasonics for what it's good for, but it seems like you've got the instrument sitting there. Just use the instrument for what it is. But you know, I remember looking at the video. There are some cool things you can do with it that normally you wouldn't be able to do with just the instrument. Like they use the Prophet X to control the granular synthesis mode, which is kind of cool because it's kind of we don't have technically granular synthesis on the Prophet X, but they of course have it in Spectrasonics, so you can use the controls to interact with it that way. So it'll be interesting to see how people use it, but it's definitely there because they have the disadvantage of not having a control surface, a dedicated control surface.
And just to respect time, we have like one more question for you.
Okay.
Hi. So earlier today you said MIDI is just 1.0 and it's been that way for decades.
Yes.
I think you also said, don't ask me about MIDI 2.0.
But you're about to, right?
I'm wondering why MIDI wasn't incrementally maintained and updated, and why you aren't interested in 2.0 if there is 2.0.
Well, I got out of the whole thing right after it was released because I'm not very good at, maintaining an organization and dealing with all of that. MIDI is so flexible, there really wasn't any driving reason to make a big revision of it. People ask for, well, we want more resolution, we want faster, this and that. The faster thing is not a problem because it's all on USB now anyhow, or within the box, so you don't have to worry about speed. You can do higher resolution controllers, that's already in the spec. And again, with SysX, you can do anything you want. Even back then, though, we added, we added tape sync, we added a lot of different features and the lighting stuff, so there were add-ons to MIDI, but nothing that changed the basic protocol. So there was really nothing that would kick it up to a 2.0. Now, I know there are a number of things going on now. There's, MIDI HD or MIDI this and MIDI that, and I haven't been keeping track of it. But I'm guessing that at some point there will be something new, officially from the MMA, who is responsible for doing all of that. For me now, if there was a new spec, then that just means more work for us because we have to implement it all. It's like with MPE, we're starting to get more requests for MPE, which is, an alternate controller spec, and it's not enough yet for us to spend the development time to do it, because we'd rather just be building a new product, having to add features to old products. But at some point we'll do it, and once we do it, we'll be able to put it back in most of our instruments. But I don't know, I just, what would MIDI 2.0 be? It's more of this, more channels, more bits, faster. It has to be backwards compatible, but since MIDI is still used all the time, it's not like there's any glaring holes. Some people might have, some specialized feature that they would like based on what they're doing, but I don't know. If somebody has some ideas on what's missing, but I don't know, it still just works.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Okay, so Dave, that concludes our speech. We really appreciate your speech and your taking your time out to talk to us. It was very enlightening. It was a real, again, personal pleasure. After I told you, I talked to you about yesterday, I had your second product you ever built. So unfortunately, someone stole it, so I don't know where it's at. Again, thank you so much for participating with this, and thank you.